There is a photograph taken in the autumn of the 11th year, and if you know what you are looking at, it stops you cold. In the foreground, stacked in tight cords along a gravel path, sit thousands of small, dense cylinders, the color of dark walnut, each one uniform in diameter, each one dry and resinous and faintly fragrant even through the glass of the screen. Behind them rises a modest steel building, freshly painted, with a hand-lettered sign above the roll-up door. In the far background, barely visible through the tree line, the pale concrete towers of the Harmon Valley paper and pulp mill press up into a gray November sky. The woman standing beside the stacked cords is not smiling in any triumphant way. She looks tired and careful, and perhaps a little wary of the photographer. Her hands are stained dark at the creases. She is wearing the same canvas work jacket she wore in year one, when people drove past her lot and slowed down to stare at what she was doing, and then drove on shaking their heads. Her name was Delia Marsh, and for a decade the mill had been depositing its bark waste at the edge of her inherited 2 acres like it was doing her a favor. The district manager at the time, a man named Costello, had in fact told her exactly that. He had told her, with great patience and a kind of institutional warmth that was somehow more irritating than contempt, that the mill's bark transfer agreement with the previous owner had been a generous accommodation. He told her she was free to have it hauled away at her own expense, or she was free to let the arrangement continue, and that the arrangement, in his estimation, was to her benefit. She had looked at the mounded dark heaps of shredded and chunked bark, at the tannin-stained runoff threading toward her low corner, and she had said, "I will keep the arrangement." Costello had nodded warmly. He had driven away, satisfied. What Costello did not know, and what no one in Harmon Valley knew, was that Delia had spent the previous winter reading her uncle's notebooks. Her uncle Wren had been a furniture maker, a cabinet man, and before that, a sawmill operator, and before that, a boy who had grown up in the forests of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where his own grandfather had worked a charcoal kiln. Wren had died, leaving 43 composition notebooks filled in a cramped, tilted hand, cataloging everything he had ever learned about wood, its behavior under moisture, under heat, under compression, under time. He had written about bark specifically, about the way bark held volatile oils in its cellular layers long after the sapwood had given them up, about the way compressed bark burned longer and more evenly than raw chunk wood, and about something he called the resin memory of a tree. The idea that a living organism stores its identity in its outermost layer, and that this identity, properly managed, could be unlocked as concentrated, slow-combusting fuel. One passage, written in 1987, read, "The tree does not forget what it was. You only have to ask it correctly." She read those words in January, sitting at her kitchen table with the notebooks spread around her under a single overhead bulb, the Michigan wind pressing against the windows. She read them again. She understood them not as poetry but as engineering. The plan she assembled from Wren's notebooks and from her own 3 months of evenings spent in research was precise and unglamorous. She would need a mechanical compressor to form the bark into uniform briquettes. She would need a low-temperature kiln to drive moisture out without igniting the volatile compounds prematurely. She would need a curing shed with controlled airflow so that the finished product could stabilize before it was packaged. She made a list of the equipment. She made a list of the costs. She had $11,000 in a savings account, the residue of her uncle's estate after the land was tallied. She spent $8,400 of it in the spring, and she began in April. The neighbors noticed within 2 weeks. The compression rig made a rhythmic, heavy thudding that carried in the still air, and the shed she was building on the east side of the lot was not the kind of structure a person puts up to store garden tools. Raymond Ellery, who ran the hardware supply 4 miles up the county road and considered himself the informal assessor of practical activity in the area, came by on a Tuesday morning and stood at the fence line watching. He asked what she was making. She said fuel. He looked at the bark piles and then at her and then at the bark piles again, and he said it in exactly the words that a man like Raymond Ellery would say it. "Honey, you cannot burn bark. It won't draw. It'll smolder and go out and fill your kitchen with creosote. She said, I know. He waited. She did not explain further. He left with the particular expression of a man who considers the matter settled. What Raymond did not understand, and what no one in Harmon Valley understood because no one had read Wren's notebooks, was that smoldering was the point. Not kitchen fire, not heating. Smoke. Controlled, dense, aromatic smoke, the kind that a competition pitmaster or a small-batch charcuterie producer or a serious backyard cook would pay a real price for, because the bark of certain tree species, compressed and kiln-dried to a precise moisture content of between 9 and 12%, produces a smoke profile that chunk wood or standard wood chips cannot replicate. Wren had written about it in 1991. The bark carries the outer life of the tree, the years of weather and resin deposit. When you burn it slow, you burn the whole biography of that tree. Oak bark tastes like autumn. Cherry bark tastes like something you cannot name but will not forget. The mill sent Delia a mixture of species, predominantly oak and hard maple with occasional cherry, because that was what Harmon Valley's surrounding forest offered. And Delia had understood from Wren's notebooks that this was not a problem. It was a product. By June, she had produced her first test run of 400 units. They were small cylinders, roughly 3 inches long and 1.5 inches in diameter, dark brown, firm, with a faint oily sheen and a dry, resinous smell that intensified when you snapped one in half. She sent 20 of them to a food writer in Detroit she had contacted through a smoking enthusiast forum. She sent 20 to a competition barbecue team in Tennessee, whose results she had followed in an online circuit. She sent 20 to a charcuterie operation in Vermont that had published a lengthy piece in a trade journal about the difficulty of sourcing consistent smoking fuel. She kept the remaining 340 in her shed and waited. The food writer responded in 11 days. The barbecue team responded in 6. The Vermont operation sent a form email at first, then a follow-up from the owner herself at the end of the week. All 3 said a version of the same thing, using their own vocabularies but reaching the same conclusion. This was something they had not encountered before. The smoke was different. It was layered and sustained, and did not turn acrid at the 2-hour mark the way chips routinely did. The Vermont owner used the phrase bark-forward complexity, which became, without Delia ever deliberately coining it, one of the phrases that would follow the product for the next decade. Costello came back in August of that first year, as he did every August, to confirm the continuation of the transfer agreement. He parked his company truck and walked to where Delia was loading finished units into labeled cardboard boxes. He looked at the boxes. He looked at the compression rig. He asked what she was doing with the bark. She said she was selling it. He looked at the boxes again, and a small, kind smile moved across his face. The smile of a man absorbing information he finds harmless. He said that was very enterprising. He said, if she ever needed more volume, the mill typically diverted excess bark to a municipal composting contract, but he might be able to route a larger share her way. She said, I would appreciate that. He nodded and left. He thought the smile was a kindness. It was not. She sold 920 units in that first partial season, through a combination of the forum contacts, one small specialty food fair in Traverse City where she rented the cheapest table available, and a brief mention in a regional grilling newsletter that had perhaps 2,000 readers. The revenue was $4,600. It did not cover what she had spent. She had expected this. Wren's notebooks had said almost nothing about commerce, but her own arithmetic had told her the early years would be foundational, not profitable. She noted the number in a ledger, and she went back to work. There was a woman named Sylvie Crane who came in September of the second year. Sylvie had driven up from Kalamazoo because her husband, a serious amateur pitmaster, had read about the bark cylinders in a forum thread and had sent her with an instruction to purchase as much as she could carry. Sylvie arrived and stood watching Delia work the compressor for approximately 20 minutes before she said anything. Then she said, "How long have you been doing this?" Delia said, "A year and some." Sylvie said, Do you have anyone helping you? Delia said she did not. Sylvie looked at the curing shed and the kiln and the orderly cord stacks, and she said, plainly and without ceremony, I used to run a production floor. I know what I am looking at. This is a system. It is not a hobby. Delia looked at her. She said, I know. Sylvie said she would come back the following Saturday. She did, and she brought work gloves, and she stayed through November, and she came back in spring, and they never formally discussed the arrangement beyond a small hourly wage that Sylvie accepted because she said she was learning something worth learning. Together, they doubled production in the third year. They began selling through a small regional distributor who served specialty food stores in Michigan and Ohio. They built a simple website with a white background and product photographs that Sylvie took on her phone on a cold, clear morning when the light was good. They had no marketing budget. The product sold because people who used it told other people, and because the barbecue and smoking community, which had its own newsletters and forums and annual events, was and remains a community where a genuinely different product circulates by word of mouth with a velocity that no advertisement can purchase. Delia did not attend any of those events. She sent samples when asked. She filled orders. She went back to work. In year 4, a buyer from a national specialty grocer flew to Harmon Valley and sat in Delia's kitchen drinking coffee and offering terms. The terms were generous in volume and inadequate in price, and there was a provision requiring exclusivity that would have severed her existing accounts. She said no. The buyer had the same expression Raymond Ellery had worn years before, the expression of a man who considers the matter settled by common sense. He said she was leaving significant revenue on the table. She said, I know where the table is. He flew back to his office and she went out to the kiln. She did not record the buyer's visit in her ledger because it was not a transaction. But Sylvie wrote about it in a short note that she kept in the same drawer where Delia kept Wren's notebooks, and the note said simply, she knew the difference between a price and a value. The mill's transfer volume increased year by year without anyone at the mill noticing what the volume was becoming, because it remained categorized internally as bark disposal diversion, a line item in the waste management column, a cost being avoided. Costello visited every August and always complimented the operation's growth with the same institutional warmth, the warmth of a man who is generous towards something he has not thought to assess. In year 7, he brought a junior environmental compliance officer named Parks, who was doing an internal audit of the diversion agreements. Parks looked at the curing shed, which had expanded to twice its original size, and at the labeled pallet stacks waiting for a distributor pickup, and at the hand-lettered sign above the door, which read, Marsh Bark Fuel, and he said nothing to Delia but wrote something in a notebook. Costello said, in his warm way, that Delia had done something really remarkable with what had essentially been the mill's refuse. She said, yes. He waited for elaboration. She offered none. Parks filed his audit, and the audit produced a recommendation from the mill's legal department. The transfer agreement should be restructured. Specifically, the bark was potentially a commodity being diverted from its market value. A reformulated agreement might include a tonnage fee. Delia received the letter in February of year 8. She read it twice and set it on the table beside Wren's notebooks. The tonnage fee they proposed was $17 per wet ton. At her current intake, that would have cost her approximately $22,000 per year. She called the law office of a woman in Grand Rapids named Hendricks, who specialized in agricultural and small production commercial law, and she explained the situation in full. Hendricks reviewed the original agreement, which had been written between the mill and Delia's uncle in 1989, and which Delia had inherited along with the land. Hendricks told her the original agreement, properly read, had constituted a disposal easement with an indefinite renewal clause, which the mill had continued to invoke annually for 10 years by their own conduct, and that the mill's unilateral attempt to reclassify bark as a commodity sold to Delia rather than waste disposed at her lot would require renegotiation of the agreement at its foundation, which in turn would require the mill to acknowledge that it had been relying on the easement rather than managing independent waste disposal, and that this acknowledgement carried its own regulatory implications for the composting diversion contract they held with the county. Hendricks advised Delia to respond in writing with a polite reference to the terms of the original agreement and to offer to continue on existing terms. Delia sent the letter. The mill's legal department took 8 weeks and then agreed to continue the arrangement. Costello called to deliver the news personally, in his warm way, and said that of course the mill had always valued the relationship and there had been no intention to cause disruption. Delia said, "I know." She went back to work. In the autumn of year 8, Harmon Valley Paper and Pulp entered a period of financial difficulty that had been building for several years. Connected to a collapse in the regional market for a specific grade of paper, their primary equipment was configured to produce. The difficulty was not immediately visible to most of the county because the mill continued to operate and the trucks continued to move, but the internal restructuring involved renegotiating every vendor and disposal contract the mill held. The composting diversion contract with the county was one of the casualties. The composting facility raised its own rates, and the mill could not absorb the increase, and the bark volume that had been split between Delia's lot and the composting facility was now, suddenly and entirely, a problem. The interim operations manager who came to see Delia in March of year 9 was not Costello, who had taken an early retirement package in the restructuring. His name was Ritter, and he was younger and visibly stressed, and he carried a folder with figures in it. He sat at Delia's kitchen table and explained that the mill was looking at a significant increase in bark disposal costs, and that the existing transfer agreement, which had been running for now nearly 2 decades, was perhaps not structured to reflect the actual volume the mill now needed to divert. He said the mill was exploring whether a revised arrangement might involve the mill paying Delia a diversion fee, rather than the previous framing of the arrangement as an accommodation to her. He set a number on the table. The number was 60 cents per wet ton. Delia looked at the number. Then she looked out the window toward the curing shed, where Sylvie was working. Then she looked back at Ritter. She said, 60 cents is not a serious number. Ritter said the mill's current position was extremely constrained. She said she understood that, and that she was willing to sign a 10-year revised agreement for $6 per wet ton, with a fixed volume ceiling at the current average intake plus 15%. She said this would be good for both of them because it gave the mill a predictable, long-term disposal pathway at a rate far below the composting alternative, and gave her operation the volume certainty she needed to justify expanding her kiln. Ritter looked at his folder. He spent 2 weeks consulting with the mill's legal department, and then he came back and signed. The agreement was the last structural piece the operation needed. With volume certainty guaranteed for 10 years and a modest but real income stream from the diversion fee, Delia went to a community development lender in Traverse City and secured a loan of $41,000. She used it to build a second kiln and to purchase a commercial-grade labeling and packaging unit, which allowed her to produce a retail-packaged version of the bark cylinders for the first time, in a craft paper sleeve with a simple printed label that showed a cross-section of bark magnified to show its cellular structure. The packaging cost 3.5 cents per unit. The retail price was $14 for a pack of 10. The product reached a national audience in year 9 through a single review in a print and online grilling magazine with a circulation of 80,000. Written by a staff writer who had received a complimentary pack at a regional food event and had used the bark cylinders on a brisket over a 12-hour smoke. The review used 4 sentences that became, without design, the brand's public identity for years afterward. It said, "This is not a gimmick. It is a bark fuel produced in Michigan from paper mill-diverted hardwood bark, compressed and kiln-dried by a woman who figured out something the specialty smoke market had not thought to ask for. The smoke is different in a way you will notice on the first bite and remember for a long time. The tree does not forget what it was." That last sentence came from Wren's notebooks, which Delia had quoted in conversation with the writer without any sense that it would become the phrase most associated with marsh bark fuel. But it did. It appeared on the revised label in year 10, printed in small letters at the bottom of the craft sleeve. It was on the banner at the 2 trade shows Sylvie persuaded Delia to attend in year 10. It was in the tagline of the website, which had by then been rebuilt professionally using a portion of the loan. The tree does not forget what it was. It had been a furniture maker's private observation, written in a composition notebook in 1987, and it had found its way by a long path of patience and bark and compressor thud and kiln heat and curing shed air and early cold mornings with a thermos of coffee onto a product sitting on a specialty grocer's shelf in 14 states. The financial record for the year of the photograph, the 11th year, showed gross revenue of $341,820, derived from direct online orders, the regional distributor account, 4 specialty grocery partnerships, and a new wholesale arrangement with a commercial charcuterie supply house in Chicago that sourced through Sylvie's own contact network. The loan was fully repaid by July of that year, 8 months ahead of schedule. Delia noted this in the ledger with the same handwriting she used to note everything else, which is to say plainly and without ceremony. Raymond Ellery came by that November, the November of the photograph. He had driven past the operation for 11 years and watched it grow with the consistent expression of a man revising an opinion he will not acknowledge having needed to revise. He stopped his truck and walked to where Delia was checking a pallet before it went out. He looked at the cylinders and at the packaging and at the roll-up door and at the hand-lettered sign and at the second kiln, whose exhaust pipe was throwing a thin white curl against the November gray. He said he supposed she had figured something out. She said she supposed so. He said he had thought the bark would smolder and go out. She said, "It does smolder. It just does not go out." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was glad it had gone well. She said she knew he was, and she thanked him for saying so, and she meant it, and she looked back at the pallet. She is not on social media. The brand has an account that Sylvie manages, and the account is popular in the smoking and grilling community, and the posts are photographs of the product and of the curing shed, and occasionally of the mill's tree line visible through the shed's open door, which Sylvie frames in a way that is neither resentful nor ironic, but simply honest about the origin. The mill itself changed hands twice between year 8 and the time of this writing, and has been partially retooled for a different paper grade. The bark transfer agreement was honored by both successor companies. It appears in Marshbark Fuel's contracts file in a manila folder labeled, in Delia's handwriting, Original Arrangement, as if to preserve the word Costello had used, the word that had been meant as a small condescension and had turned out to be accurate in a way he had not intended. Wren's 43 notebooks sit in the same drawer in Delia's kitchen where they have always been. Sylvie has read them all. There is a young man from Harmon Valley named Cade, who has been working the kiln for 2 years and who is learning the moisture calibration protocol, which Delia wrote out in her own composition notebook from Wren's original notes, simplified in some places and extended in others to account for the specific characteristics of the mill's species mix. The protocol is 12 pages long. Its first line reads, "Bark is the tree's outermost attention. Everything else the tree learned, it put there." The photograph was taken by a journalist doing a piece on small industrial waste conversions for a regional business publication. The journalist asked Delia what she would say to someone who was sitting on a resource that everyone around them had decided was worthless. Delia thought for a moment. She said, "Find out what it remembers." The journalist wrote it down. She went inside for coffee. Sylvie went back to the curing shed. Cade checked the kiln temperature and noted it in the log. The mill's pale towers stood at the tree line the way they always had, and the bark came in and the cylinders went out, and the ledger continued in the same plain handwriting, number after number, year after year, the record of a woman who had read a dead man's notebooks in January and decided that the question was not whether the waste was worthless, but whether she was willing to do the work of asking it correctly. The tree does not forget what it was. You only have to be patient enough and willing enough to find out what it knew.